Picture a man who is sworn before God to own nothing. No property, no income, no coins of his own. He has given his entire life to poverty. Now picture that same man sitting behind a heavy oak table, counting out a loan to a farmer, and writing down, in careful Latin, exactly how much extra the farmer will owe him at harvest. He is a monk. The extra payment is interest, the thing his own church calls a mortal sin, a crime worthy of hell. And he has found a way to charge it without ever breaking a single rule. Not by lying, not by hiding, but by using the law itself, word by word, until the sin had a new name, and the new name was holy. This is the story of the loophole that turned monasteries into banks, and of the men in robes who built, out of legal fictions, the machinery of modern finance. We need to start with the wall that everyone in this story is trying to climb over. Because to understand how clever the loophole was, you have to understand how absolute the rule was. By the 12th century, the church's position on lending was not a suggestion, it was iron. Charging interest on a loan, usury, was condemned again and again at the highest levels of Christendom. The Third Lateran Council in 1179 barred open usurers from communion and from Christian burial. The Second Council of Lyon in 1274 tightened the screws further, and the Council of Vienne in 1311 went furthest of all. It declared that anyone who stubbornly insisted usury was not a sin should be punished as a heretic. Read that last part slowly, because it is easy to miss how extreme it is. By 1311, it was not merely a sin to charge interest. It was heresy to even argue that charging interest might be acceptable. You could be burned for the opinion. The doctrine had become so total that questioning it put your soul, and sometimes your body, in danger. And the reasoning behind it ran deep. Medieval theologians, following Aristotle and then Thomas Aquinas, held that money was barren. A coin cannot breed. A cow can have a calf. A field can yield a harvest. But a gold piece locked in a chest for a year is still just one gold piece. To charge for the use of something that does not grow was, they said, to charge for nothing at all. Theft dressed up as a contract. And there was a second argument, quieter but just as powerful. A lender who charges interest is charging for the passage of time. But time is not the lender's to sell. Time belongs to God alone. So the wall was as high as a wall could be, moral, legal, spiritual. And on the other side of it sat a simple, immovable fact that no council could vote away. Medieval Europe ran on credit. Someone had to lend. Farmers needed seed money in spring, or they would not plant. Lords needed cash to equip soldiers before a campaign. Towns needed capital to raise walls and dig wells. Merchants needed advances to move wool and wine and salt across a continent. A society can outlaw interest on parchment. It cannot outlaw the need for it. The need simply goes looking for a door. And here is the detail that almost nobody hears. The institutions holding the greatest reserves of idle wealth in medieval Europe, the deepest stores of grain, land, silver, and stored value, were not the kings. Kings were usually broke or close to it, drained by war. The richest organizations on the continent were the monasteries. Think about how they got that way. For centuries, dying nobles had left land to the great abbeys to pray for their souls. Pilgrims gave gifts, peasants paid tithes, kings granted estates. A house like the Abbey of Cluny, at its height, controlled a network of hundreds of dependent monasteries and vast holdings across Europe. The Cistercians ran agricultural estates so efficient they produced huge surpluses of wool and grain. These were not humble huts of prayer. They were, in economic terms, some of the largest and most liquid enterprises of their age. And their wealth was not only vast, it was trusted. A monastery did not run away in the night. It did not die and leave a disputed estate. It stood in the same valley for centuries, with stone walls, locked vaults, armed protection, and a reputation for keeping records that no private merchant could match. If you wanted somewhere safe to store gold, or a lender who would still be there in 20 years to honor a long agreement, the abbey on the hill was often the single most reliable institution for a day's ride in any direction. Kings deposited treasure with monasteries for safekeeping. Nobles used them as trustees. Towns turned to them in a bad harvest. In an age with no central banks, no deposit insurance, and no reliable royal treasury, the monastery was, in practice, the closest thing the ordinary world had to a bank, long before anyone would have dared to call it one. So look at the shape of the problem. The people most forbidden to lend, men under a vow of poverty, were sitting on exactly the surplus that everyone else desperately needed to borrow. A continent starved for credit, and its biggest reservoirs of capital were locked behind a religious wall. That tension could not simply hang there forever. It had to break somewhere. And it broke, not into open rebellion against the doctrine, but into a set of contracts so quietly clever that theologians would argue over them for the next 300 years. The first workaround did not hide the interest in a fee. It hid it in land. Imagine again our farmer. He needs money, and he comes to a monastery. The monastery cannot charge him interest. That door is closed. But it can accept a piece of land as security against the loan, a pledge. And here medieval lawyers drew a distinction that would echo down 1,000 years and into your own life. If a loan was secured by land, there were two ways to handle the crops and rents that the land produced while the debt went unpaid. In the first arrangement, the vif gauge, the living pledge, the income from the land was counted against the debt, slowly paying it down year by year. This was considered acceptable. The lender took nothing extra. The land was, in a sense, working off the loan. But in the second arrangement, the mort gauge, the dead pledge, the lender kept all the land's income for himself the entire time, and that income did nothing to reduce what was owed. The farmer still had to repay the full loan at the end, in full. Everything the land produced in the meantime, every harvest, every rent, every load of timber, flowed straight to the lender, on top of the principal he would get back anyway. That income was interest. Everyone knew it was interest. The church's own canon lawyers openly complained that the dead pledge was usury wearing a disguise. But the disguise held because it gave everyone something precious: deniability. The lender was not charging for the loan. He was merely holding a pledge and collecting its fruits. He was, on paper, doing something the law permitted, even while doing something the law forbade. And the word survived every one of those arguments. Centuries later, the English jurist Sir Edward Coke would explain the term plainly. It is called a mortgage, a dead pledge, because if the borrower fails to pay, the land is taken and, as far as he is concerned, dead to him forever. And if he does pay, the pledge is dead to the lender. When you take out a mortgage today to buy a house, you are speaking medieval French. You are using a word invented to rout lenders and monks past a religious law that no longer exists. The loophole outlived the rule it was built to dodge, by nearly 1,000 years and counting. But the dead pledge was clumsy. It needed land, and it invited grumbling. The most important loophole of all was far more elegant. So elegant that the church would eventually stop tolerating it and start blessing it outright. It was called the Census. Here is the move, and it is worth watching closely because it is the intellectual heart of this entire story. Instead of lending a farmer money and charging him interest, the monastery would buy something from him. Specifically, It would buy the right to a stream of annual payments. The monastery hands over a lump sum of cash today. In return, every year the farmer pays a fixed amount, often tied to the produce of a specific field or vineyard, for a set number of years, or in some versions, for the rest of his life. Now look hard at what that actually is. The monastery pays out a sum of money now and receives a larger sum back, spread across time. In pure economic terms, that is a loan with interest. There is no difference in the cash flow. But legally, in the eyes of canon law, it was not a loan at all. It was a sale, a purchase. The monastery had bought an asset, a right to income, exactly the way it might buy a vineyard or a mill or a fishing pond. And profiting from an asset you rightfully own was never, ever a sin. That was just property. That was the whole basis of the medieval economy. Let me make it concrete with a simple example, because the elegance only lands when you watch the numbers move. Suppose a monastery hands a landowner 100 florins today. In a forbidden loan, the landowner would have to repay those 100 florins plus, say, 8 florins of interest each year, and every churchman in the room would call it sin. So instead, they write a census. The monastery does not lend 100 florins. It buys, for 100 florins, the right to receive 8 florins every year, drawn from the yield of a named vineyard. No interest rate is written anywhere. No loan is recorded anywhere. There is only a purchase price and an income. And yet the monastery has laid out 100 and will collect 8 a year, year after year, precisely the return the forbidden loan would have paid. The money moves identically. Only the words on the parchment have changed. A scribe who wrote loan and interest was recording a mortal sin. A scribe who wrote purchase and annual yield was recording an honest investment. Same florins, same vineyard, same men, different nouns. This is the deepest idea in the whole history of the loophole, so let me state it as plainly as I can. The medieval mind did not believe interest was evil because the lender ended up richer. Monks, abbots, and popes all grew rich from land and rents, and no one blinked. Interest was evil for one specific reason, because the lender made his money from a loan, from the barren, sterile act of renting out a coin and demanding more coin in return. The sin was attached to the category, not to the profit. And so if you could simply change the category from loan to purchase, from interest to income from an asset, the exact same flow of money transformed from a mortal sin into an ordinary, blameless piece of business. There were 2 flavors of it, and both mattered. In the perpetual census, the payments went on forever, generation after generation, until the seller or his heirs chose to buy the whole thing back at the original price. In the life census, the payments ran only until the seller died, an early cousin of the modern annuity, a bet on how long a man would live, dressed in the language of a sale. Churchmen argued about which was more defensible, but both spread widely because both filled the same desperate need for credit in a world that had outlawed the honest word for it. The census contract became the workhorse of medieval and early modern finance. Monasteries used it constantly, both as buyers and, when they needed cash, as sellers. When a great abbey wanted to rebuild a church, or ransom an abbot, or survive a famine year, it could sell a census on its own lands, take a lump sum today, and promise the buyer a slice of next year's harvest income. The same instrument ran in both directions, and it wove the monasteries directly into the credit web of every town around them. Cathedral chapters used it, bishops used it, and then something enormous happened. Cities and princes discovered it too. A city that needed money to fund a war or build a cathedral could sell census rights to its citizens, take their cash now, promise them a fixed annual payment forever. That instrument, the perpetual rent charge, is the direct ancestor of the modern government bond. The public debt of Europe was born, in large part, out of a loophole invented to get around the Church's ban on interest. And the Church did not just look away. It formalized the whole thing. In 1425, Pope Martin V issued a formal ruling that declared the census contract legitimate and laid down the precise conditions under which buying an income was licit, that it be secured against real, immovable property like land or a house, and that redemption follow strict rules. 30 years later, in 1455, Pope Calixtus III confirmed and reinforced it. Two popes in the 15th century writing the official rule book for a contract that paid interest in everything but name. Sit with that for a moment. Roughly 300 years after the Church declared interest a mortal sin, and a little over a century after Vienne made it heresy to defend it, the papacy itself was drafting the fine print for how, exactly, a good Christian could lend money and collect a return on it, as long as he called it the right thing. The intellectual work behind this did not happen by accident. It was done, over generations, by the same class of men who had built the prohibition in the first place: theologians. And they built a vocabulary precise enough to carry the weight. They developed the idea of interesse, a Latin word meaning, roughly, that which lies between, the difference or the loss. This is, quite literally, where our word interest comes from. The theory went like this. Charging simply for the use of money was still forbidden. But if lending money caused the lender a genuine loss, or forced him to give up a genuine gain, then he could be compensated for that specific loss or gain. Because he was not charging for the loan itself, he was being made whole. Compensation, not profit. And by the early 16th century, respected theologians like Cardinal Cajetan, one of the sharpest minds in the Church, were writing careful defenses of exchange contracts and census arrangements, mapping out exactly where legitimate business ended and true usury began. Nor was this only a lawyer's game of definitions. Some of the very same friars who preached against usury were quietly building the beginnings of real economic theory. Bernardino of Siena, one of the most famous preachers of the 15th century, thundered against greed from the pulpit, and yet in his sermons he worked out strikingly modern ideas about why money invested in a live working business is genuinely different from a coin lent out cold. Capital put to work, he argued, carries risk, effort, and a seed-like power to produce more, and a share of that increase might justly belong to the man who supplied it. That was not a defense of usury. It was the first faint outline of the idea of profit on capital, sketched by a monk in the middle of an anti-usury crusade. The men tearing down interest and the men building the theory that would replace it were, very often, the same men, in the same robes, sometimes in the same sermon. They debated these things ferociously and in good faith. Some were convinced these instruments were honest risk-sharing that the poor and the merchant alike genuinely needed. Others saw the same contracts as usury with fresh paint, sin smuggled through a door of clever words. But here is the crucial thing, the mechanism that made it all work. The debate itself did the work. As long as reasonable, learned churchmen could plausibly argue that a transaction was not technically usury, the men doing the lending had all the cover they needed to operate, quietly, respectably, and at enormous scale. By the 15th century, the loopholes stopped being quiet workarounds altogether and became an institution the Church built and ran on purpose. And to understand why, you have to understand the human problem underneath it. Poor people needed small loans, not grand sums to finance a war, a few coins to buy a tool, to feed a family through a hard month, to pay for a burial. But small loans to poor people are the riskiest lending there is, and canon law had pushed Christian lenders almost entirely out of that market. Into the gap stepped the only lenders willing to take the risk, often at rates that could climb to 30, 40, even 60%. To reformers inside the church, this looked like a scandal. The poor, crushed by the very ban that was supposed to protect them. There is an uncomfortable piece of this history that has to be told plainly, because it shaped everything that followed. Since canon law forbade Christians from lending at interest, much of the everyday small loan business across parts of medieval Europe had fallen to Jewish communities, who were barred from most guilds and trades and permitted, under the law of the time, to lend where Christians could not. This was not a matter of character. It was a structure the Christian authorities themselves had built, forbidding their own faithful to lend, then resenting those they had left to do it. The Monti di Pietà were founded, in part, explicitly to replace those lenders with a Christian, church-run alternative, and the preaching around them too often carried an ugly edge of hostility toward the very people the system had forced into the role. It is a reminder that these financial loopholes were never purely technical. They sat inside real communities, and they carried real human cost. So, starting in the 1460s, Franciscan friars in Italy tried to solve it directly. Preachers like Bernardino of Feltre traveled from town to town, and behind their sermons they founded a new kind of institution, the Monte di Pietà, literally, the Mountain of Piety, a charitable pawnshop run by the church itself that lent small sums to the poor against pawned goods, a cloak, a tool, a bit of jewelry, at a low charge meant only to cover the cost of running the place. And the instant it opened, the old ghost walked back in. Because to survive, to keep the lights on and pay the clerks, the Monte had to charge something on each loan, a small fee. And the question rose up exactly as it always had. Was that fee usury? The Franciscans said no. It was not profit, they argued. It merely covered the salaries of the staff and the upkeep of the building. Without it, the charity would collapse and the poor would be thrown back to the 60% lenders. The Dominicans, their great rivals in theology, said yes. A charge on a loan is a charge on a loan, they insisted, and calling it an operating cost does not change what it is. To bless it was to bless usury and betray 300 years of doctrine. The two orders fought over this from pulpits across Italy for decades, a genuine, bitter, sincere theological war, fought not by cynics, but by devout men who each believed the other was endangering souls. And in the end, it took a full church council to settle it. In 1515, the Fifth Lateran Council ruled formally and finally. A modest fee, charged by a charitable lender purely to cover its own costs, was not usury. The Monti di Pietà were declared not merely permitted, but praiseworthy, good works, worthy of support. And some of those institutions never closed their doors. The Monte dei Paschi di Siena traces its origins to a Monte di Pietà founded in Siena in 1472, created for the express purpose of fighting usury by lending to the poor. It is still in business today, which means the oldest surviving bank on earth is a charitable pawnshop born of a Franciscan movement that began its life as a loophole around the church's own ban on interest. So step all the way back now and let the whole shape come into view. Nobody in this story ever repealed the ban on usury. Not the monks who bent it, not the merchants who exploited it, not the popes who signed off on the workarounds. The doctrine stood, on paper, in full force, for centuries after everyone involved had quietly learned to route around it. In principle, charging interest remained a sin the entire time this was happening. What changed was never the rule. What changed was the category. A dead pledge was not a loan. It was a pledge, and you were only collecting fruits. A census was not interest. It was a purchase, and you were only enjoying an asset. A Monte's charge was not usury. It was a cost, and you were only covering expenses. Every single one of these was a relabeling. A decision to describe the very same movement of money using a word the law had not thought to forbid. And the men doing the relabeling were not, for the most part, cynics smuggling sin past a sleeping God. Many of them were sincere theologians and honest friars, wrestling in genuine good faith with an impossible gap. The gap between an absolute moral law they truly believed in and an economy that simply could not breathe without credit. They were not lying about the doctrine. They were engineering a narrow space where reality could go on existing right beside it, without either one destroying the other. That is the quiet lesson underneath all the robes and the Latin and the councils. When a hard rule collides with a hard need, the rule almost never breaks cleanly in two. It gets interpreted. It gets bent. Word by word, exception by exception, ruling by ruling, until one day you look up and the men who swore before God to own nothing at all are the ones running the banks. And if that pattern sounds familiar, it should, because we never stopped doing it. We did not abandon the medieval trick of renaming a thing to make it acceptable. We industrialized it. When modern finance wanted to charge interest without the ugly word attached, it invented fees and points and carrying charges. When it wanted to sell debt as if it were something safer, it wrapped it in new names: structured products, instruments, vehicles, until the risk underneath disappeared behind the vocabulary on top. When a lender today advertises a loan with 0% interest and a large origination fee, he is doing exactly what a 15th century monastery did with a census, keeping the return, changing the noun. The dead pledge became the mortgage. The census became the bond. The Monte's fee became the service charge on your account. The specific words have all been replaced, but the move underneath them, describe the money in language the rule cannot reach, is the same move, unbroken, running in a straight line from a monk's ledger in Siena to the fine print you scroll past without reading. The robes came off centuries ago. The habit of renaming never did. Which raises the real question this whole story leaves behind. When the church bent its own absolute law until it meant almost nothing, was that hypocrisy? A great institution failing to live by the rule it forced on everyone else? Or was it something more honest and more human than that? A slow, painful, centuries-long admission that the rule had been wrong, or at least impossible, from the start. The doctrine said money was barren. The world kept proving, harvest after harvest and loan after loan, that money put to work was anything but. Maybe the loophole was not the church betraying its principle. Maybe the loophole was reality, patiently correcting it. These monks and friars found the doorways through the wall. They squeezed credit through cracks in canon law, one legal fiction at a time. But there was one order that did not sneak through any loophole. It built a financial empire so vast, so powerful, and so trusted that it held the treasuries of kings, moved money across a continent at war, and answered to no local bishop at all, only to the Pope himself. The Knights Templar. How they rose to become Europe's first true bank, and how it ended with a king who owed them far too much money. That story is next in this series. So what is your verdict? Were these contracts honest solutions to an impossible problem? A faithful people finding a humane way through an unlivable rule? Or were they simply sin with better paperwork? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe, because we are only at the very beginning of the story of how faith built finance.